Hi, my name is Hod Greeley. I'm a staff engineer here with Samsung at our San Jose Mobile Communications Lab. Today, I want to talk about something we call the Android way, and what I really want to emphasize is that with Android, there's some features to it that make it kind of special and really kind of change how you build an application. So some of the benefits of the Android way, in particular what we'll talk about is that we're going to be discussing how you use other applications to augment or include parts of what your application is going to do. So really part of the emphasis is on how you would build an app so that you can focus on what you do well and then make use of what other applications do well. So we'll go through and talk about how that's going to provide a seamless user experience, how you can share data and functionality, and how you can customize user experience kind of end to end. So key components, we want to talk about what are those key components in the Android framework that really make it possible to do this. So today we'll talk about activities, which are really the main part of your UI. We'll talk about services. We'll talk about content providers. This is how you provide your data to other applications. We'll talk about broadcast receivers, and then we're going to talk about how that all gets glued together through the Android framework. So the first thing we want to talk about is an activity. An activity really encapsulates, you can think of it as encapsulating one focused interaction, one goal. So for example, here we have a situation, imagine you're using phone contacts, so you have a situation where you want to be looking at your phone contacts versus creating a new contact. So those are two different focused activities. So the activity lifecycle, we'll talk a little bit about how Android really structures things to allow you to know when you're going to do particular setup of things, when you have to do teardown of information. And with activities, it's a little bit more complicated, so we want to step through that a piece at a time. So a few things to know about Android that are important, that are potentially different from other platforms, is that Android is a true multitasking system. This means that you can actually have other things going on at the same time. So it may be a matter that you want to fire up something else that's going to cover over your application, or another application is going to pop up that's going to cover what you're doing. And so this is going to affect your life cycle because you may have notifications that are coming in and things shifting around. And so this adds a little bit of complexity to things. So just to go through, having said all of that, what ends up actually being most important are really a few of these callbacks. Android is structured to be mostly run asynchronously, so what happens is typically you'll implement a class and you'll implement certain callbacks that you'll get that will inform you whenever something's happening. So in the activity lifecycle case, we have a number of callbacks. We have things like onCreate, onStart. I don't want to run through the whole list. What I'm really going to do is highlight the ones that are really kind of most key to you as a developer. So the most important ones, the system will fire up your activity and then you'll get this onCreate callback. This is really the onCreate callback is where you're going to go ahead and set up most of the key things to your application. So you're going to want to initialize all of these kind of any kind of long-standing structures, or just getting your app ready to go. After that, there are other callbacks where you could do other things, but typically, at least in my experience, I've just used the onCreate method. And then after that, your activity is up and running. It'll be displayed to the user, assuming that you've triggered that. And then what will happen is that if you get something else that comes in and covers it, or for whatever reason, you'll get this, what they call the onPause callback. So this is kind of the one that mirrors things a bit. And the onPause, what's important to know about onPause is that onPause, despite the other callback, onPause is the only one you're kind of guaranteed to get before the system can rip the rug out from under you. So this is a key one to know about, that this is where you're going to want to tear down any kind of long-standing things. So if I've set up like media or anything like this that I don't want to hold on to because of the resources or whatever, this is where I'm going to tear it down. Then you have a bunch of other things that can go on depending on whether your app's really completely gone or is just kind of in the background waiting or things like that, but we won't get into that too much. So a key point that I really want to focus on today and that I really want to get across to people with programmers is the way in which Android is really kind of a different environment than your typical monolithic program that you have like under Windows or anything like that. It's not really your standard development environment, or it's not the standard way that you are used to writing an application. And to illustrate this, first we'll talk about activities in a bit of detail. So what happens with an activity is that your application, instead of being made up of a series of activities that are only the ones that you've built, can actually be set up as a series of activities that are a combination of what you have built as a programmer and activities that you're pulling from other applications. This may sound a little strange, but you can still create a very seamless user experience, and in a very nice way, because it allows you to focus on the tasks that your application is good at, or that are the things that you want to focus on most, and then use tools from other applications where they excel. It's possible to do things like pass data back and forth. So in terms of the UI flow, what you'll see is that an application ends up being made of a stack of activities, and you're really kind of putting things on top of the stack and taking them off of the stack as you flow through things. And then, as we've spoken about already, is that this is a true multitasking system, so even though you might have an activity that is not on top of the stack, is not visible, you might still be doing some processing with it. So to illustrate this, we're going to keep going back to this diagram in particular, and what I'm illustrating here is that I have two applications. So these are the APK files that I distribute and that other developers distribute. And an APK file may contain several components. It may contain all the four that we talked about. And then what happens is that, and what I'm illustrating here is that one application can use components from another. So we have the diagram that shows application A, and we'll be going back to showing how it's then using pieces out of application B. So we've talked about the four key pieces. Now we want to talk about how you expose data to another application. This is done through something called a content provider. A content provider can store and retrieve data, and here we're talking about things like images, audio, contact information, but really any kind of data that you may want to expose in a structured way to another application. And also it's what you need to understand to figure out how you're going to access data in a structured way from another application. So kind of the key concepts about a content provider are the application stores data however it chooses, and then you expose that data through a content provider, and then the data is accessed from another application using a content resolver. But then really what boils down to the most important thing to know is that when you supply a URI, the URI is structured so you can kind of map it to a SQL query, and then what you get back is a table that looks like a standard relational database table full of your information. So the example here, I'm pulling up a contact list, and you can see that I'm getting back a structured table that's giving me an ID, but then a unique ID, then a name, an address, phone numbers, that kind of thing. Content provider, again, this is something that can be an element within another application. So I have here the illustrated application A. I have an activity. This activity is what wants to access the data from application B. It's going to go ahead and through the Android system, tell the system that it wants to access the data. Application B is going to fire up its piece that is actually going to go look at the way it stored its data and then figure out how to present it as a structured relational database table. So the next part of the four main things that I talked about that I'll bring up is a service component. A service is something that's designed to do something that's kind of long-running but doesn't have a UI piece to it. So a classic example is you're playing music. You might have some kind of long-running application calculation that you're doing, or you might be doing some network activity that's going to take a while. Now, services also have a life cycle. They're simpler than an activity's life cycle, but there is a little bit of a trick to them in that a service has two different life cycles depending on how you're accessing it. So a service can be built so that you're going to access it purely from inside your own application, which is not what we're focusing on today, or it can be built to be accessed from another application. And so just to look at the life cycle when we're accessing it from another application, it's similar to an activity but simpler. So the main thing that you're going to worry about here, the two callbacks, are one on create. So again, this is where you might do some setup. But also you get your on-bind callback. So on-bind is when that's your notification when another application has actually bound to you to access the service functions. And so that would be a place where you might actually also do a lot of initialization. And then you have the clients interacting. This is where you're essentially running live, supplying information. And then you'll get an on-unbind callback. So this is where an application has actually, is in its essence, is notifying you that it's done with its access to your service. But you don't necessarily want to shut the service down because other things might end up using it. So then what really you're going to look at finally for your final teardown is the on-destroy callback. So key concepts with a service, that a service is in some ways almost the opposite of an activity in that there's no UI. You're typically actually going to run for longer times. It's always in some sense running in the background. And briefly, there's a way that Android prioritizes what it's going to kill, and that's something that's important to know about, and services are less likely to be killed than other things. And not surprisingly, like its name, a service acts like a server, which I think we've kind of emphasized with that whole notion that another application is a client to it, even though you're running on the same device. So we're not talking about a server that's running across a network, but locally. So here again, we're going back to our diagram. We have application A, it's got its activity running, and it's going to bind to a service in application B. What's nice about services and really important about them is that they provide you a really rich way of interacting with another application. A service, you can really think of it when you want to boil it down to, is it will act like another class that's in your application where you can do direct calls onto it. So as opposed, we'll get into how data is transferred in some of the other components, but with a service, you can really do anything you want. So the last one we'll talk about now is a broadcast receiver. Broadcast receiver is very straightforward. Its intention is quite simple. What it's there for is to recognize events like system events or events coming from other applications, decide what to do with them quickly, and then either process it right then and there or pass on any kind of longer running thing response to something else. Again, it's something that has no UI component. It's intended to run essentially in the background. It's got an extremely simple life cycle. In fact, there's one callback. It's the on-receive callback, and that's all you need to care about. And you've got 10 seconds to deal with that, and after 10 seconds, the system will kill you, so you've got to get in, get out, and get done. Broadcast receiver, same packaging, same idea. Application A has its activity. Application B has exposed its broadcast receiver to receive certain events. Application A can actually do broadcasting of an intent to fire up something in application B, or you might be listening for system information like a battery event or things like this. Now that we've talked about these different components, you're probably wondering, how do we connect all these things? We haven't really discussed how these integrate with each other. So this is something that's key, that's unique to Android, and it's something called an intent. An intent is actually a sort of passive data package that you can think of. So an intent is not something that you fill and then use to call, inform the system that you're doing something. All you're going to do is bundle things into the intent and then hand it off to the system, and the system will take care of delivering it. We'll talk about how that's going to happen. So the three components that are activated by intents are the activities, services, and broadcast receivers. The content providers we already talked about are attached to in different ways. One other thing that's important about an intent is to know is that they're actually really flexible. So this is quite nice in that you can do a lot more with, say, something like a service, but you can do a huge amount already with an intent. So typically you don't have to do that much more with something complicated like a service. Intent can contain any kind of data you want. It's also going to contain some things that help define how that thing's going to be directed to one of the other components in the system. And the way that direction is controlled is through the manifest file. So the manifest file is how you're going to tell the system which components in your application you want to expose, either actually internally to your own application or to the rest of the world. The manifest file, it's called Android Manifest. It's an XML file, so it's a structured XML file. It's going to describe all of the components that make up the application. It's going to control entry and access to those components. And so the key elements there, the most critical part to know other than just the basics of how you define a component in your application, are the intent filters. So we talked about intents, and then the intent filters are going to tell the system in this nice flexible way which kinds of intents your application is going to listen to, and in particular which components are going to listen to which particular intents. So the way you can filter intents on several things. An intent can have an action. An example is editing. It can have a category, an example being whether something's browsable. Or it can talk about what particular kind of data it can deal with. So you can go by MIME type, or more extensively you can go by a scheme, like you can decide that it's HTTP access and also like a video MIME type. So you have a huge amount of flexibility in how you define which intents you want to handle. And this goes back to our whole overall concept that one application can make use of components from another application. So you don't have to actually know which component you're going to use in another application. You might simply say, for example, I want to get a photograph selected, and rather than picking a particular camera application, you more or less announce, I want to get a photo, go for it. System figures out which applications can handle getting a photo and handing it back, and then it can actually let the user decide which of those to use. So here's an example of how an intent's going to flow through the system. We have a little bit of a code example here that's going to show the basics of what you'll always see in this kind of work. So here we start out with one activity on the code on the left side. And here all you see is creating a new intent, and then we're starting to bundle things into it. None of these are actually required, so here we're choosing to set the action. We don't necessarily need to set an action. And then we're putting in some extra data, and of course all that's optional. You're then going to hand off the intent. There's two ways to hand it off. We'll just talk about the start activity for result today. And this is where you're handling this passive bunch of data to the Android system, and then the Android system is going to take care of looking inside this passive data and figuring out how to route it to an end destination. So it's going to go ahead and take that intent. It's going to go look through all of the manifest entries, pre-process these, pair them up, and then it's going to go ahead and funnel that intent to an activity or a service or whatever it is that's going to be able to handle it. Okay. And then we see here the code that actually peels apart the intent on the other side, and it's quite straightforward. Here we go to an example of a manifest. We really wanted to illustrate here. We've got just 2 entries. We wanted to illustrate in particular that your manifest can actually expose a whole large number of entries. You want one for each kind of activity or service or broadcast receiver in here. And then what we're seeing here is we've got the activity that's labeled, and then within it we have the intent filter or filters that are going to determine, tell the system when to activate that thing. So, and here's a particular example that we kind of wanted to highlight because this is important for pretty much any application where a particular activity intent filter, there's one specific pairing of intent filters that are going to cause the system to decide to put your icon for your application into the launcher to make it available for the touch the icon and away you go kind of startup. And that intent filter is one where you give it a name of action main, or an action, excuse me, and then a category that's the launcher category. So main entry point, that's a category of the launcher, so the launcher can trigger it. So now to summarize all of the pieces that we've talked about, the main thing I wanted to get across is that Android is not your typical application environment. In a lot of ways, you really want to think about how you're going to structure your application, not like a monolithic thing where you have to think of everything, but think about what you're good at and what other components that are around you to use are good at and how you want to mix those together. The key components, the 4 main components that we talked about are and how they correspond to things. Your UI corresponds to your activities. Long-running things like music playing or something like that correspond to services. Data is going to be exposed through content providers. And then finally, quick reaction to events is going to be handled by your broadcast receivers. And that's the end of our presentation, and thank you for listening.